My name is Elif Shafak. I'm a Turkish writer. I write in both English and Turkish. I see myself as a storyteller. I started writing at a very early age, but that's not because I wanted to become a novelist one day. To be honest, I didn't even know such a thing was possible. But I was a very lonely child. I was an only child. I was raised by a single mother. And there were moments in my life when I felt some cultural alienation because around the time I was 10 years old, my mother became a diplomat, and she and we traveled a lot. So over time, I think books became my best friends, and stories became the only continuity in my life. That's how I started to write, you know. And afterwards, stories evolved into novels. I have written 13 books, 9 of them are novels. The desire to become a writer came to me much later, in my early 20s, but the need, almost the existential need for stories came to me much, much earlier in life. It came to me when I was a child. I was born in Strasbourg in France. Then I came to Turkey with my mother to Ankara, and I was raised partly by my grandmother. Afterwards, I spent part of my childhood in Madrid. And there were moments when I, visited Köln in Germany, Amman in Jordan. Then I came to Istanbul in my early 20s, thinking the city called me. I wrote several of my books in Istanbul, and Istanbul always has a very strong presence in my books. But I also feel a bit suffocated in Istanbul, so I always run away from her. So I lived in Boston, Michigan, Arizona, and now London and Istanbul. I think life has always been very nomadic for me. The status of women in Turkey is in a way a complicated issue because Turkey is full of contrasts and conflicts. On the one hand, Turkish women and Kurdish women are very visible and vocal in many areas, including media, medicine, banking, finance. You see women in these areas as very strong personas, but at the same time, it is a country in which there are honor killings, child brides. We find it very difficult to talk about rape, incest. I think Turkey is a very patriarchal society. It is at the same time very homophobic, very sexist, and lots of things are so internalized. It is difficult to talk about them. There is one area in Turkey in which women are almost non-existent, and that is politics. At the local, regional, and national level of politics, it is a very, very male-dominated world. I am not an apolitical person, and I don't think if you're a writer coming from Pakistan, Nigeria, Turkey, Egypt, you name it, if you're coming from countries where democracy is very wobbly, where the future is very uncertain, I don't think as a writer you have the luxury of saying I don't care about politics, I'm outside politics. You just can't do that if you care about the society, the people, the injustices, the inequalities. There is a political dimension in my work. However, politics is never my primary guide. This is a very important distinction for me. My primary guide is always my imagination, So politics can only be the second degree, but the first and foremost thing for me is just the ability to tell stories, universal stories, and just to let imagination free. English is in fact my third language. Once upon a time, Spanish was my second language. But from the moment I connected with the English language, it never abandoned me. I never abandoned it. I love thinking in different languages. I wish I could write in German because its vocabulary so attracts me. But I think today's world is a world in which more and more people are dreaming in more than one language. When we sleep, sometimes one part of the dream is in one language, we end the same dream in another language, because the mind, the human brain, makes no such distinctions. If I can dream in more than one language, which I do, then I can write fiction in more than one language. My connection with the Turkish language is very emotional. My connection with the English language is very cerebral, intellectual. And there are things I prefer to say in Turkish first. There are things I prefer to say in English first. I love the commute back and forth between languages. It's what motivated me when I started writing in English was a passion for language. But when I say this, I'm talking about basics, you know. I have a passion for the alphabet. It still amazes me to this day how we can create endless number of meanings with very limited number of letters, you know. I love that process. I love that game. If I'm writing about sorrow, maybe the past, maybe melancholy, I find it easier to say these things in Turkish. If there's irony, satire, sarcasm, humor, strong humor, I prefer the English language. But basically what I do is I write each novel, and I've been doing this for the last 12 years now. I write each novel in English first, then it's being translated by a professional translator into Turkish, and then I take the Turkish translation and I rewrite it. So in a way I write every book twice. It's insane, but the only reason why I do it is because I love language. Each language has its own labyrinth, has its own melody, and I love to hear that. I don't think we control language. I think very much language shapes us. Languages shape the way we think, and it pains me a lot that the Turkish language lost an important part of its vocabulary, because many words were taken out of our language because they were not Turkish enough. So in a way, there was a homogenization of the language, because the Ottoman language had Arabic words, Persian words, Turkish words. You know, all of those Arabic and Persian words, not all, but most of them were taken out. So our vocabulary shrunk, in fact. And I think when our vocabulary shrunk, our imagination shrunk. Our ability to express ourselves and to think in more complicated ways also diminished. Because when you lose words, you lose also your way of thinking and your imagination. I care about those nuances. So the words that we have taken out in the past, I put them back when I write my books in Turkish. As I travel around the world, sometimes I come across women who say, you know, we don't need feminism anymore. Unless you're living in the Middle East or in the East, you know, we don't need it anymore. You might be critical of feminism. You know, feminism has its own limits as well. But I don't think we can be disrespectful of feminism. I have a lot of respect for women's movement, for what our mothers and grandmothers struggled for. You know, maybe I believe in post-feminism, in a kind of approach that wants to go beyond feminism, but also respecting the feminist legacy. I think this is very important, and it should be universal, because sometimes women forget that the rights that they have today cannot be taken for granted. One day you can lose them if you don't appreciate those rights. This is very important. So when I come across especially young women who say, you know, I don't care about the women's movement, that makes me sad, because I do sincerely believe that we need a universal network of solidarity and sisterhood among women. We need to try to develop a new language, a new approach that goes beyond this very sectarian and antagonistic, you know, and very male-dominated political language that is everywhere. There are lots of things that we women can create when and if we get together. But for that to happen, we need a feminist or a post-feminist consciousness. So I don't belittle the feminist legacy at all. I have a lot of respect for DLD, the spirit that is, you know, motivating DLD conference. It's very ironic. I mean, one would expect in today's world to see many more conferences that are like this, because it's a much more globalized world. However, when we look at the reality, there aren't many platforms that are like this. This is a very special venue that brings women from completely different disciplines together, also from very different cultures together, and enables us to hear each other's voices, to learn from each other's experiences, successes but also failures as well, together. That kind of shared spirit is something that we're very much in need of in today's world.